She was starving, shaking, about to give birth, and no one came. A dying bobcat, abandoned in the wild, left to fade into the dirt like she never mattered. But then came a dog. Not just any dog, Ranger, a German shepherd with no training for wildlife, only instinct. He didn't growl. He didn't chase. He lay beside her, like a soldier guarding a fallen comrade. And behind him, a woman running from her past, stepped into her purpose. What happened next will break your heart and then rebuild it, one breath at a time. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe animals are more than wild, that even nature whispers for help sometimes, hit that subscribe button. Because this story will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. Cedar Ridge, Colorado, lay under a hushed morning sky, the kind that felt like the world was holding its breath. Fog curled low over the fields, wrapping the edges of pine and aspen trees in a soft gray veil. The sun had only just begun to rise, a faint line of amber along the peaks of the Rockies. In the middle of this serene isolation stood a weather-worn farmhouse, its white paint flaking, its windows still crusted with dust from seasons gone by. Lucy Harper stepped out onto the creaking porch with a chipped ceramic mug of black coffee. 42 years old, she had the look of someone who'd seen life peel back both its beauty and its cruelty. Her face bore the gentle lines of a woman who had smiled often, but not recently. She was tall and lean, dressed in old jeans and a faded flannel shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbows. Her auburn hair was braided roughly over one shoulder, a few rebellious strands tucked behind her ear. She looked out over the overgrown pasture, not as a farmer, not yet, but as a woman trying to understand what it meant to stay still for once. Ranger sat beside her. The 6-year-old German shepherd lay calmly, but his ears were alert, nose twitching faintly at the scents drifting across the field. His coat was a rich black and tan, with just enough silver frosting his muzzle to suggest wisdom. Though powerful in build, there was something old soul about him, measured, deliberate. He was a rescue, gifted to Lucy by a colleague during her last month at the Houston Wildlife Center. She'd named him Ranger, after her grandfather, who'd worked for the Forestry Service until his death 2 years prior. The nickname had followed him for decades, the Mountain Ranger. It felt only right that his legacy live on in the quiet, watchful dog who had become Lucy's constant since the day she left the city behind. This morning, Ranger had woken first, pacing the doorway and occasionally glancing back toward her, as if to say, "Something's out there." He hadn't barked, just waited. Now, his body shifted slightly, eyes narrowing toward the north edge of the pasture. "What is it?" Lucy asked softly, setting her mug down on the porch rail. She followed his gaze and squinted through the haze. Something stirred in the tall grass beyond the fencing. She grabbed the coat she'd slung over a chair and started walking, Ranger falling in beside her, not in the bounding gait of a dog excited to chase, but something slower, more controlled. As they neared the fence line, Lucy saw it. At first, just a shadow against the ground. Then it moved, barely. A twitch, a tremble. Her heart sank. It was a bobcat, barely breathing, emaciated to the point of collapse. Its ribs protruded, its fur patchy and dull. The animal's sides heaved with short, rapid breaths, and its amber eyes were glazed with pain. And beneath the ragged fur of its belly, Lucy saw the unmistakable swell of pregnancy. "God," she murmured, kneeling cautiously. "She's pregnant." She reached instinctively for her tranquilizer kit, only to remember that it was still packed in a box in the pantry. She had no sedatives, no assistance, no surgical tools, only her instincts, her training, and a dog who somehow understood that this was not prey. Before she could say anything, Ranger moved forward. His posture remained low, respectful. He didn't growl, he didn't rush. He circled once, then settled in beside the bobcat, not touching, but close enough that his presence felt intentional. Lucy stared, hardly believing what she saw. She had treated too many dogs with bobcat wounds, and vice versa, to believe this was anything but a miracle. "Ranger," she said softly, as if trying to remind him he was still a dog. But he didn't budge. His eyes were fixed on the wild creature in front of him, and in that moment, he looked like he belonged to something older than training, something elemental. Lucy moved slowly, unbuttoning her coat and laying it gently beside the bobcat. The animal didn't move, but her breathing calmed slightly. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She checked the screen. Emma. Lucy hesitated before answering. Hey, Em? The voice on the other end was sharp, distant. Did you forget I had midterms this week? Lucy blinked. What? No, You said you'd call Sunday night. It's Thursday. I'm sorry. Things have been a little intense here. A little intense? You're in the middle of nowhere, Mom. What could possibly be intense? A raccoon in the trash? Lucy swallowed. Actually, I'm with a pregnant bobcat who collapsed in my field. She's barely alive. I think she's in labor. There was silence on the line. Finally, of course you are, Emma muttered. That's what you do, right? Take in things no one else can fix. Lucy flinched. That's not fair. You left everything behind. Your job, Dad's city, me. Lucy's voice softened. I didn't leave you, Em. I couldn't keep doing what I was doing. Not after everything. You know that. No, I don't. You never explained anything. You just ran. Emma's voice cracked at the edges. I have to go. Good luck with your bobcat. The line went dead. Lucy closed her eyes for a moment, then slid the phone back into her pocket. She turned her focus back to the animal, reaching carefully to check her vitals. Weak but stable. The contractions had likely started already. If the bobcat didn't get fluid soon, she and her kittens wouldn't survive the night. She glanced sideways at Ranger. You keep surprising me, she murmured. You know that. His tail flicked once, lightly against the grass. And then Lucy said it again, like a memory surfacing from somewhere buried deep. The forest always sends a ranger when the woods get too quiet. Her grandfather had said it every time they found a wounded bird or stray fox as kids. She looked at the dog, guarding the wild with a patience most humans couldn't muster. Guess it sent me you. She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. Come on, Ranger, let's get the barn ready. The sun had fully risen now, casting gold over the field. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried over the treetops. The wind shifted, and with it, Lucy's pulse, like something long dormant, was finally beginning again. The barn was colder than she remembered. Lucy pushed the door open with her shoulder, one hand cradling the limp weight of the bobcat wrapped in a worn flannel blanket, the other gripping a flashlight. Dust motes danced in the beam like snowflakes suspended in time. Ranger entered first, his paws silent on the wooden floor, nose in the air, scanning the space as if checking for unseen threats. The barn, though aged and cluttered, had good bones, rough-hewn beams, a pitched roof, and enough space to create a makeshift recovery area. Lucy gently laid the bobcat down on a folded horse blanket near the old goat pen. The animal hadn't stirred much since they left the field, but her breath still came in shallow, determined pulses. Lucy crouched beside her, brushing strands of fur from the animal's dull coat. We'll call you Willow, she said softly. Strong, flexible, rooted in harsh ground. Ranger watched from a short distance away, lying down with his head on his paws, his ears still twitching at every small sound. She rose and turned toward the storage shelves at the back of the barn. They were cluttered with old tack, feed buckets, a rusted scythe, and boxes sealed with brittle masking tape. Her grandfather had stored everything in this barn: tools, memories, pieces of lives lived in rhythms tied to the land. As she searched for any remnants of her old field equipment, she paused in front of a wooden cabinet with a warped door and brass handle. The key still hung on a nail beside it. Lucy hesitated, then unlocked it. Inside, she found stacks of yellowed notebooks, orderly but weathered by time. The top one was labeled in neat block letters. Field Notes, 1985 to 2001. She sat down on an overturned crate, setting her flashlight beside her, and opened it. Pages and pages of meticulous handwriting greeted her. Her grandfather's voice echoed through the script, concise, clinical, yet quietly poetic. She flipped through sketches of deer leg fractures, notations about fox den relocations, field maps, and finally, she stopped. A dated entry, penned in ink slightly smeared by rain. Female bobcat found near the old spring, malnourished, pregnant, treated for dehydration. She returned a month later with 3 kits, left them in the hollow log by the stream. Lucy stared at the page. She traced the lines of a quick sketch: triangular ears, slanted golden eyes, rounded belly. The cat in the drawing could have been Willow. She closed the notebook slowly and hugged it to her chest. The pages still smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco. You saw her too, she whispered, or one like her. Ranger huffed quietly, rising to his feet and walking over to sit beside her. She rested her hand on his head, fingers curling into the thick fur behind his ears. "You feel it, don't you?" she murmured, "that we've been here before." The barn creaked in response, a sound as familiar as breath. She set the notebook aside and began clearing a corner space for medical supplies. A dusty shelving unit nearby still held glass jars, sterile gauze, rolls of vet wrap, old syringes sealed in faded plastic. She worked methodically, pushing her sleeves higher, opening each box with hope and a little fear. Most of the saline bags were expired, but she found a sealed electrolyte powder mix and some injectable vitamins she could still use. Next, she opened a smaller drawer under the cabinet, half expecting mice. Instead, she found an empty leather-bound notebook, thick with unused cream-colored pages. The inside cover had a sticky note in familiar scrawl, "For you, kiddo, in case you ever come back." Her throat tightened. She sat back down and placed the book on her knees. The pencil she pulled from her pocket felt heavier than usual. Date, May 4th. Patient, female bobcat, approx, 4 to 5 years, visibly pregnant, presenting with dehydration, extreme fatigue, poor coat condition. Name, Willow. First discovered in northern pasture, collapsed. Transported to barn at 7:45 a.m. Vital signs stable but weak. Prognosis uncertain. Ranger nosed the edge of the journal, tail flicking once. Lucy smiled faintly. "Yeah, I think he'd approve." As the afternoon light shifted to a warm amber, Lucy prepared a simple rehydration formula and filled a shallow metal dish. She placed it beside Willow, who stirred slightly and lifted her head no more than an inch before collapsing back down. Her breathing was slower now, but less strained. Lucy spoke gently as she worked, continuing her habit from years of instructing interns, though this time her only audience was a dog. "We'll need to get food into her by tonight. Maybe some pureed venison from the emergency supply. And if labor starts, I'll need towels, scissors, disinfectant." She stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. Then the barn door creaked open. Startled, she turned to see a figure silhouetted against the setting sun. It was Cora Simmons, her nearest neighbor, mid-50s, square-shouldered, and tough as nails. She stood a little over 5 feet tall, with cropped gray hair and a perpetual frown carved by decades of mountain wind and no-nonsense living. Dressed in flannel, denim, and worn boots, Cora looked like she'd been born and raised by pine trees and tractor smoke. She was known around Cedar Ridge as both fiercely private and fiercely loyal, provided you earned her trust. "Thought I saw movement from the ridge," she called out, stepping into the barn with a limp that spoke of an old injury. "Figured you might be having some sort of wildlife emergency. Again?" Lucy gave a sheepish smile. "You're not wrong." Cora's eyes settled on Willow, her face softened by a fraction. "She's in rough shape." "Pregnant," Lucy said, "malnourished, might go into labor early." Cora nodded, then looked down at Ranger. "Still got the forest in him, doesn't he?" "More than most people." "I brought you some clean towels and a fresh battery for the barn lantern," Cora added, holding up a plastic bin. "Figured you'd be too busy to make it into town." Lucy's chest tightened with gratitude. "Thank you, really." Cora placed the bin beside the shelf. "You need anything else, you holler?" Lucy watched her walk back out into the twilight, Ranger quietly following her to the gate, and then returning without a sound. The bobcat stirred again. Lucy looked at the soft rise and fall of Willow's chest, then at the pages she'd begun to fill. She felt the moment click into place. Not like a decision, like a memory. She reached for the pen again. The first tremor came just after midnight. Lucy had stayed curled on a cot she'd dragged into the barn corner, wrapped in an old army surplus blanket that still smelled faintly of cedar and dust. A single dim lantern cast long shadows across the walls. Ranger lay near Willow's makeshift bed, his head low between his paws, though his eyes never fully closed. He was listening, always listening. Willow shifted, a low whine catching in her throat. Not a growl, not pain exactly, but something tight and internal. Her flanks twitched, and her paws tensed as if trying to dig into the blanket beneath her. Lucy was at her side instantly. She pressed her fingers gently along Willow's abdomen and felt the rhythmic tightening beneath her skin. "You're not ready," Lucy whispered, "but your body doesn't know that, does it?" She scribbled in the leather-bound journal beside her. 2:14 a.m. Contractions observed. Pulse elevated. No signs of full labor, risk of premature delivery high, immediate support required. Ranger let out a low chuff, his ears flicking. He stood and stepped closer, positioning himself just behind Lucy, watchful but calm. Willow, for her part, made no attempt to move away from him. Lucy reached for her phone and, without hesitation, dialed Ben Rowe. It rang twice before he picked up. His voice was gravelly, threaded with sleep. "Lucy?" "Sorry," she said. "I wouldn't call unless it was urgent." Ben sat up. Even through the static of the connection, Lucy could hear his sheets rustling. "What's going on?" "Bobcat, pregnant, possibly premature labor, weak vitals. I need a second opinion." There was a pause. Then, "You have fluids on hand?" "Electrolyte mix and vitamins." She took some water earlier. Breathing's shallow, contractions started an hour ago. "Send me a picture of her abdomen and breathing pattern. I'll guide you through until I can get there." Lucy stepped back and quickly snapped 2 photos in the dim light, sending them off with shaking fingers. She hadn't heard Ben's voice in months, maybe a year. He had always been the quiet kind, a thinker, methodical. In college, they were inseparable. He was tall, lean, with a hawk-like face framed by dark brown curls, always kept a bit too long. Last she saw him, he'd grown a beard and taken a teaching role at a wildlife medicine program in Santa Fe. The phone buzzed, a reply. Early contractions, but she might hold off if stabilized. Get her calm, keep the temp steady, I'm leaving now. Lucy let out a breath and turned back to Willow. "Help's on the way." Ranger moved closer, laying down again just beside Willow's flank. He was close enough now that their breathing almost synchronized. The bobcat blinked slowly at him, her ears twitching once, but there was no sign of fear. Lucy watched them and felt that odd, low hum again, the sense of something sacred, something outside explanation. She noted it in the journal. Observation. Willow remains calm in Ranger's presence. No stress behavior. Possible imprinting or shared instinct. A scratching sound interrupted her thoughts. Ranger's ears perked. He rose immediately, body tense. Lucy turned toward the sound, flashlight in hand. The beam landed on a pair of glinting eyes just outside the broken bottom panel of the barn wall. A feral cat, thin, dust-colored, tail flicking as it watched the scene inside. It took a step closer. "Not now," Lucy muttered. Ranger stepped forward, posture rigid but non-aggressive. He released a low growl, deep, warning, protective. The cat hissed, then turned and darted back into the dark. Lucy rubbed her temple. Even the barn cats know something's happening. Ranger returned to Willow, placing himself firmly between her and the barn's opening. An hour passed. Lucy fed the lantern another battery and began reorganizing her supplies for the 3rd time. She couldn't sit still. She thought of calling Emma just to hear her voice, but stopped herself. The last conversation had left something raw. Now wasn't the time. Instead, she flipped back through the field notes from her grandfather. She found another entry, this one from 1989. Willow number 2, delivered kits beneath the hayloft, watched from a distance, never once showed aggression, uncommon trust. Made me wonder, what do animals see in us that we fail to see in ourselves? Lucy stared at the name. The first Willow wasn't the only one. She looked at the new Willow, breathing steadily again, body quiet, tail curled around her belly. Her phone buzzed. "Ben, I'm 20 minutes out. Roads are good. Want to set up a heat lamp near her side and dim the overhead? Let her body stay relaxed. Contractions should slow if her cortisol drops." "Got it. Thanks, Ben." "And Lucy?" "Yeah?" "That name, Willow, you picked it?" She smiled faintly. "Yes." "Good choice. Willow trees bend, but they don't break. Fragile-looking things with unshakable roots. Seems fitting." His voice faded into the background static as the call ended, but the words stayed with her. She stepped back to Willow and turned the lamp lower. Ranger yawned beside her and nudged his snout lightly against Lucy's arm before resting it near Willow's hind legs. "Yeah," Lucy said. "Fitting indeed." She sat down and picked up the journal again. 3:59 a.m. Contractions slowing, breathing steady. Shadow movements in the barn. Ranger remains alert. Outside threat, feral cat. Warded off without violence. Ben en route. Willow remains stable. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the high branches of the pines. The barn creaked but held steady. Inside, the wild and the domestic lay side by side, sharing breath. And for now, that was enough. By the time the sun dipped below the peaks of the Rockies, the wind had already changed. What had been a whisper earlier in the day now howled across Cedar Ridge like something wild and searching. Pine branches snapped, and the barn creaked under the first gusts of a mountain storm. Lucy stood just outside the door, holding the handle in one hand and scanning the horizon with narrowed eyes. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. A storm was coming, fast and mean. Inside, the dim lantern cast warm light across Willow's makeshift bedding. The Bobcat was curled tight, breathing steady, her contractions having calmed under Lucy's watch and Ranger's constant presence. Ranger lay pressed against the outer edge of the hay bedding, his broad chest rising and falling slowly, but his eyes flicked constantly toward the barn doors, then to the cracks in the old wood walls where wind began to whistle through. Lucy stepped back in, locking the door with a metal latch, then grabbed 2 heavy storage bins and shoved them against the bottom. The barn had stood for generations, but tonight it felt too thin, too vulnerable. As she pushed another bale of hay into the corner, her phone buzzed. A message from Ben. "Storm hit Santa Fe already. Drive was rough, but I'm 10 minutes out. Got supplies." She typed quickly. "Be careful. Something's out there." And there was. It started as a low vibration through the ground, too subtle to name, like a string plucked somewhere deep in the forest. Ranger sat up. His hackles didn't raise, but his body stiffened with awareness. Lucy followed his gaze toward the barn's eastern side. That's when she heard it. A sound like gravel grinding against iron, low, guttural, and unmistakably feline. A mountain lion. Lucy froze. Her heart stuttered, then steadied. She moved swiftly across the barn and flipped the switch on the sensor lights outside. Nothing happened. She cursed under her breath. Dead battery, of course. Ranger was already at the door, not barking, but standing rigid, a low hum rising from his chest. Lucy grabbed the small toolkit by the lantern and yanked out a spare sensor light she hadn't yet mounted. With shaking hands, she pulled open the side door, bracing it against the wind, and crouched beneath the overhang to affix the light above the outer frame with a drill that whined like an insect. When she stepped back inside, the motion light flicked on at last, casting a harsh white beam across the snowy field and fence line. Nothing there, yet. She slammed the door shut and turned to Ranger. "Stay close." A gust hit the barn so hard the rafters groaned in protest. Rain began to hammer the metal roof in earnest, a deafening rhythm that made it hard to hear her own breath. Willow stirred restlessly but didn't panic. Lucy knelt by her side and murmured soothing words, hands stroking the Bobcat's thin shoulders. Then, finally, headlights. Ben's truck pulled into the muddy slope leading to the barn, tires crunching over wet gravel. The vehicle came to a slow stop, and out stepped Ben Rowe. He wore a dark rain jacket, heavy boots caked in red clay, and carried a duffel bag over one shoulder. He still looked like the same man she remembered, taller than most, with that ever-furrowed brow and quiet energy. His beard was flecked with gray now, and the lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened since their last meeting. Ben entered without knocking. "Lights caught my attention halfway up the road. What's going on?" "Mountain lion," Lucy said. "I haven't seen it, but Ranger's on edge. I trust him more than a spotlight." Ben nodded once and dropped the bag. "I brought fresh IV bags, warm fluid packs, and that sedative we talked about. You good here?" "For now," she replied. They worked together quickly, checking Willow's vitals and replacing her bedding with fresh hay layered with clean towels. Ben's touch was practiced, efficient, but his eyes kept darting toward the dark corners of the barn. "I used to dream of coming back to the wild," he said after a while, voice low. "Didn't expect it to feel like this, like being watched." Lucy didn't answer right away. She moved to the barn door, peering out the small window cut into its center. The light outside still glared, catching bits of swirling rain, but no eyes, no fur, no movement. "Have you ever heard that story about the forest ranger leading animals home?" she asked suddenly. Ben looked up. "What kind of story?" "My grandfather used to tell it. Said when storms came, the old ranger would walk the edges of the forest, guiding lost animals back where they belonged. He said the wind always followed him, like it trusted him." Ben studied her. "And you think of that now?" She glanced back at Ranger, who was once again curled beside Willow, though his gaze never left the barn door. Yeah, I think tonight he's the ranger. Later, as the storm raged on, Lucy fell asleep seated against the door, her coat pulled tight, journal still open on her lap. She dreamed, though later she wouldn't be sure if it was truly sleep or something else. In the dream, her grandfather stood at the tree line, wearing his old canvas coat and forestry hat, one hand gripping a walking stick worn smooth by decades of use. Around him, animals moved in pairs and small clusters: deer, raccoons, owls, even a fox with a limp. They followed him without fear, deeper into the woods. Ranger walked beside him, proud and silent, eyes forward. Lucy stood at the edge, watching, her voice caught in her throat. Her grandfather turned once, looked back, and nodded. Then he was gone. She woke with a start just as thunder cracked overhead. The lantern flickered, then steadied. Ranger stood now, tail low but steady, pressed against the barn door. The storm wasn't over, but it hadn't broken them. Not yet. The rain had not let up all night, but it had changed. From the wild hammering of the earlier storm, it had softened into a steady rhythm, almost meditative, like a breath slowly exhaled by the mountains themselves. The barn had become a world unto itself, a flickering lantern, straw-sweet air, the quiet tension of something ancient waiting to unfold. Lucy moved slowly, deliberately, brushing her hair back and tying it again with an elastic she found looped around her wrist. Her fingers smelled of hay, iodine, and fear. Willow had shifted in her nest of towels and hay. Her breathing had become shallow again, but this time it wasn't weakness, it was effort. She was going into labor. Lucy knelt beside her, one hand resting gently on the bobcat's side, feeling the tightening of muscle beneath her ribs, the ripple of life waiting to emerge. "You're close," she whispered. "We're with you." Ranger lay 2 feet away, body still, eyes wide and locked on the barn door. Not once did he look at Willow, not even when she began to pant. His ears twitched only when the wind outside carried distant noises, branches creaking, the cry of a nocturnal bird, the faint sound of tires in mud. But his presence was unwavering, a silent shield, a sentry. Ben was still asleep in the loft above the tack room, having stayed after reinforcing the barn's defenses. He had left Lucy with strict instructions and enough equipment to mimic a field clinic. Now, she reached for her phone, tapped it once, and called him. A groggy voice answered. "She started," she said. Ben was down the ladder in seconds. He wore a gray thermal shirt and utility pants tucked into boots. His beard was damp from sweat and mist, and his eyes were focused the moment they landed on Willow. He didn't speak, just nodded and knelt beside Lucy, opening the supply case. "Vitals still holding?" "Elevated but stable. She's handling the contractions well. She'll need help with the first. Look at her hips, narrower than average for her frame, and she's been through hell." Lucy looked at him sideways. "She's not the only one." Ben met her gaze for a second, the past hanging between them in a brief, shared silence, then turned back to Willow. "You're up." Lucy's hands moved by instinct, cleansing, warming towels, checking Willow's eyes, adjusting the position of her body for better leverage. The contractions came harder now. Willow didn't cry out, but her body bucked once, and a wet sack appeared at the birth canal. Ben spoke quietly, his voice low and reassuring, the same way he had taught interns in sterile rooms years ago. "Support the pelvis. Good. Watch the neck. Head's coming first." Lucy leaned in, her breath sinking with the shallow, gasping pants of the wild mother beneath her hands. "Come on, Willow. Just a little more." The kitten emerged, slick and still, eyes sealed, ribs barely rising. Lucy cleaned its mouth gently, stimulated its sides. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a twitch, a gasp, a thin, desperate cry. "Alive," she said. Ben placed a soft towel beneath the newborn. "One down." Willow licked the kitten weakly, but with unmistakable purpose. A second contraction surged through her body. Ranger didn't move, but his ears tilted, registering something outside. Ben noticed it. "He's listening for the cat?" "Maybe," Lucy said, "or maybe for angels." He frowned but didn't ask. The second kitten came easier, sliding into Lucy's waiting hands with a tiny grunt. This one was more active, squirming before she even cleared the sack. "Good girl," Lucy murmured. The barn's walls flickered with the shifting lantern light. Water dripped slowly from the beams. The air was thick with warmth and the scent of earth and straw. The third came at dawn. Lucy didn't notice the first ray of sunlight until it crept along the barn wall, cutting a line across the hay. The rain had stopped. Ranger finally moved. Slowly, reverently, he rose and turned toward Willow and her 3 newborns. He didn't approach, just stood, watching. Lucy sat back on her heels, trembling, not from fear, but from something else entirely. Relief, gratitude, awe. She looked at the 3 tiny creatures curled against their mother's belly, already searching for warmth, for life. And then, from the corner of her vision, something small and bright flashed against the window. A hummingbird. Its feathers shimmered in the newborn light, iridescent green with a white throat and sapphire wings. It hovered for a long moment just outside the glass, then landed gently on the narrow sill, barely larger than a thumb. Ben looked up. "That's early. They don't usually come this high until summer." Lucy stared. "My grandfather used to say they were forest angels," she said. "That when one visited your window at dawn, it meant a blessing had been given." The hummingbird flicked its wings, paused, then darted off into the pines. Ben exhaled. "Then consider us blessed." They worked in silence for a few minutes more, cleaning, documenting, helping Willow adjust to the weight of her litter. As the barn filled with gold and the world outside softened, Lucy sat beside Ranger, resting her back against his warm frame. He didn't lean in, didn't make a sound, just stood steady beside her like he always did. She looked at the fresh page in her journal and began to write. May 5th, 6:11 a.m. Willow delivered 3 live kittens, all nursing, mother recovering. Rain ended at first light. Hummingbird sighting at barn window. Prognosis, hopeful. The sun sat high above Cedar Ridge by late morning, casting a bright but deceptive warmth over the sodden earth. The storm had passed, but its memory clung to everything. Mud puddles and tractor ruts, branches snapped like brittle bones, and the lingering scent of ozone and wet pine. In the barn, Lucy stood at the counter near the tack wall, examining a stack of SD cards Ben had pulled from the trail cameras mounted around the property. Ben sat nearby, hunched over an old laptop balanced on a feed barrel. His eyes were narrowed, focused, scanning frame by frame. "Here," he said after a few minutes, tapping the screen. 3 a.m. last night, just past the far tree line. Lucy stepped beside him. The camera footage, black and white and grainy, showed a familiar silhouette, lean, muscular, and silent in its grace, a mountain lion. It walked through the clearing, no more than 100 yards from the barn, its eyes reflecting the infrared light like twin coals. It didn't linger, but it didn't flee either. Ben rewound and zoomed in. It sniffed the air. "You see that hesitation?" He paused the frame. "It's not just passing through, it was checking for weakness." Lucy exhaled slowly. It was hunting. Ranger, lying near Willow and her newborns, lifted his head. The tip of his nose twitched slightly, his paws were crossed, but the rest of his body was tense, a coil of fur and muscle ready to move. Willow remained curled around her 3 kittens, eyes half-lidded in maternal daze, but her ears stayed alert. "We need to reinforce everything," Lucy said. "The fence, the windows, all of it." Ben nodded. "And traps, not lethal, just deterrents, noisemakers, trip lines, motion alarms." "I have a few old ones in the shed," Lucy replied, "if the mice haven't eaten through the wiring." Ben stood and stretched. He was wearing a fresh plaid shirt under a dark vest, his face still shadowed by stubble. He looked older in daylight, more real than he had during the haze of the birth. Still handsome, but softened by years and solitude. "I'll start by checking the perimeter." "I'll prep the gear," Lucy said. For the next 2 hours, they moved in near silence. Ben walked the property line, hammering new stakes into soft ground, unspooling wire from a reel he found buried under old fencing in the barn. Lucy dug through the shed, brushing aside cobwebs and rat droppings to uncover 2 motion sensors still sealed in plastic. She found an old tool belt of her grandfather's and buckled it on without thinking. As she emerged into the clearing again, a breeze stirred the air. It carried a new scent, musky, earthy, sharp. Ranger suddenly lifted to his feet, walked to the barn's main door, and began to sniff along the threshold. Then, without warning, he scratched hard at the floor, claws raking over the wood with urgency. Lucy looked up from the coiled wires in her hand. "Ranger?" He paused, turned to her, ears pinned slightly back. Ben arrived, dirt smudged on his jeans and gloves. What's he doing? He smells something. Ben crouched near the spot Ranger had clawed. He ran his fingers along the edges. The wood's damp here. Something brushed against the outside, maybe pissed on it. Marking territory. Lucy's stomach tightened. You think it'll try a new way in? It will if it's persistent. They remember. If we blocked its path once, it'll look for another. She nodded grimly. Then we double the defenses. As they worked, something unspoken began to settle between them. Not the tense formality of professionals, but the familiar rhythm of two people who had once built things together. Meals, moments, maybe even dreams. At one point, Ben handed her a wrench, their hands brush-eyeing, and Lucy looked up. For a second, her defenses dropped. I miss this, he said softly. Not just the field work. You. She blinked, the admission catching her off guard. You left first. I know, he said, and I regretted it the minute I got back to Santa Fe. She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled the wrench from his hand and tightened the sensor bracket against the barn wall. Ben smiled faintly. Still stubborn. Still learning, she replied. They returned to the barn in the late afternoon, tools packed away, traps set, sensors tested. The place now looked more like an outpost than a barn, lines of defense mapped across wood and earth. Inside, Ranger had resumed his post beside Willow. He hadn't touched the food Lucy left him. He ate only after checking the perimeters himself. Willow, now stronger, watched him with curious eyes. Not fear, but something more primal. Recognition, perhaps? As if she'd begun to understand that this creature was not a threat, but a guardian. Lucy leaned against the stall, brushing hay from her arms, watching the scene. He won't leave her, Ben said. No, Lucy agreed. He's made his choice. Ben sat beside her, elbows resting on his knees. That cat's smart. It's circling. Sooner or later, it's going to test us again. We'll be ready. Do you really believe that? She turned to him, eyes steady. I have to. I have lives depending on it. Ben studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. Then I'll stay a few more nights. She didn't object. Outside, the shadows lengthened across the ridge. The wind carried whispers through the trees, warnings or promises it was hard to say. Inside the barn, however, the lines were clear. There were the wild and the fragile, the wounded and the watching. And there was Ranger, who stood between them all. It was nearly midnight when the barn lanterns began to flicker. The air felt heavier than usual, thicker, as though the storm from days ago had left something behind. Not in the clouds, but in the earth. Lucy stood at the edge of the stall, hand resting on Willow's side. The Bobcat's breathing had grown more labored again, her muscles taut with an unmistakable rhythm. A fourth kitten was on the way, unexpected and dangerously late. Ranger had been pacing for the last 10 minutes. A soundless, circling presence that only stopped when he froze. Ears sharp, nose pointed toward the northern wall of the barn. Ben, seated near the door with the flashlight in his lap, noticed it too. He smells something. Lucy nodded without turning. So do I. Just then, Ranger let out a deep, guttural growl. It wasn't bark or warning, it was declaration. A presence had crossed a line. Ben stood immediately, grabbed the rifle he had reluctantly brought 2 nights ago from behind the supply chest. Motion sensors haven't tripped, he muttered. They won't, Lucy said. The wind shifted again. It came from the ridge. Outside, a sound like gravel being crushed echoed against the silence. A low, padded step in soft earth. Then a snarl, quiet but unmistakable. Ben opened the barn's small window hatch and pointed the flashlight beam toward the tree line. 2 glowing eyes stared back, unmoving. Mountain lion, he said. Big one. Lucy's hands were steady, despite the pulse beating in her throat. I can't leave. Willow's in active labor. Ben scanned the field. We need a distraction. He didn't have to say it. Ranger moved toward the barn door on his own. Lucy looked at him. No. Ranger glanced back, not as if asking permission, but as if telling her, this is what I was made for. Ben opened the side door a few inches. Lucy? She looked at Willow, trembling now, one paw stretched forward with the strain of the contraction. The kitten couldn't wait. Do it. Ranger slipped out into the dark like a ghost in a soldier's body. Outside, the growl sharpened. Then came a snarl, a violent ripping sound, and the unmistakable crash of limbs tearing through underbrush. Ben grabbed his jacket and rifle. "Stay here. Lock the doors behind me." Lucy didn't argue. She dropped to the latch as soon as he slipped into the dark, then turned back to Willow. The mother bobcat's body convulsed again, her teeth bared but silent. "You're okay," Lucy whispered. "You're not alone." She wiped her hands on the cloth beside her, reached for the sterile gauze, and gently checked for crowning. The fourth kitten was positioned wrong, hind feet first. Her breath caught, but her training took over. The barn suddenly erupted in snarling and barking from outside, violent, primal. Willow whimpered. Lucy pressed her palm against the mother's shoulder. "You have to fight too. We all do." Just then, headlights crept over the horizon and came to a halt behind the barn. Lucy heard the sound of a car door and boots hitting wet earth. "Lucy?" a deep voice called out. "Back here," she shouted without looking up. Seconds later, the barn door eased open. A tall figure stepped inside, a man in his late 60s, stocky, gray-bearded, with calloused hands and a shotgun slung over one shoulder. His name was Roy Callahan, the nearest neighbor, living on the other side of the ridge. He had known Lucy's grandfather for years. "Ben called," Roy said, stepping carefully over the feed buckets. "Said we might need backup." Lucy nodded toward the window. "Mountain Lion, Ranger and Ben are out there." Roy peered out and saw nothing but shadows. Still, he set his jaw and held the shotgun close. "Your granddad and I used to do this exact thing. Different barn, different time, but same smell in the air. You know, I once saw him stand between a bear cub and its mother to protect an injured owl." Lucy kept her hands moving. "He told me that story. I thought he made it up." Roy chuckled, even as he cocked the gun. "Not everyone's brave enough to protect the wild. Most shoot first and call it justice." Willow let out a final strain. The fourth kitten slid free, smaller than the rest, but moving. Lucy cradled it in the towel, cleared its airway, and waited for the twitch, then the cry. "I got you," she said softly. "You made it." Outside, a single rifle shot cracked the air, then silence. Roy stepped to the door, listening. A moment later, Ranger reappeared in the beam of Roy's flashlight, his coat damp, panting, tail low but wagging slowly. No blood, no limp, but exhaustion clung to every muscle. Ben followed close behind, mud to his knees. He drew it off. I hit a warning shot to send it running. It didn't want a real fight, just weakness. Ben stepped into the barn and knelt beside Lucy. "You did it?" "All four," she said. Ranger collapsed beside Willow, his body curled protectively at the edge of her bedding. Willow didn't flinch. Her eyes blinked slowly in the direction of the dog. Acknowledging him, perhaps. Roy stood with his back against the door. "That lion'll be back, but not tonight." "No," Lucy agreed, stroking the newborn kitten. "Tonight, we won." The morning air held a different kind of silence now, no longer tense or waiting, but soft and whole, like the pause between heartbeats after the danger has passed. Dew glistened on the high grass around the Cedar Ridge barn, and the sun, rising behind the eastern bluff, spilled gold over the weathered roof. In the stall, Willow lay curled with her four kittens pressed tightly to her side. Their fur had dried into faint patterns, muted grays, russets, and one with a near-silver stripe that ran across her back. That was the one Lucy had begun calling Mariposa, meaning butterfly, for the way her ears twitched with every breeze. Willow's eyes were alert now, not from fear, but awareness. Healing had returned her posture, stronger, calmer, and though she remained a wild creature, she had not once tried to leave. Her gaze followed Lucy whenever she entered the barn, as if silently approving her presence. And then there was Ranger, who, over the past week, had become more than just guardian. He slept just outside the gate, never inside, keeping respectful distance. Yet each morning, as the barn door creaked open, Mariposa would race to the wire mesh, squeaking with high-pitched chirps, trying to paw at Ranger's ears through the fence. Lucy would watch them from the barn bench, notebook open in her lap, always halfway through a new entry. Her handwriting had grown smaller over time, more deliberate, as if each word needed space to settle. She had begun calling it the Book of Second Chances. The title had come to her not as an idea, but as a truth revealed, one kitten breath at a time. On this particular morning, the hum of tires crunched over gravel, and a gray sedan pulled into the drive. Out stepped Emma, Lucy's 22-year-old daughter. Tall, with sharp cheekbones and the same hazel-green eyes as her mother, She wore a Boston University hoodie and had her brown hair up in a haphazard bun. Her steps were hesitant at first. It had been 6 months since their last in-person conversation, most of them clipped calls or long silences on the phone, but something in her daughter's face had softened. There was no accusation in her gaze now, only curiosity. "Hey," Emma said, adjusting her bag over one shoulder. "So, this is the famous barn?" Lucy smiled, though a little unsure. "It's cleaner than it used to be." Emma stepped inside, blinking at the filtered light and the smell of hay, cedar, and something warm and wild. Her eyes landed on Willow and the kittens. "That's her?" Lucy nodded. "Willow, and the smallest one, she's Mariposa. You can say hi." Emma crouched slowly by the mesh. Ranger padded over, tail wagging once, ears relaxed. "He's bigger than I remember," Emma said. "He's grown into himself," Lucy replied. "Some dogs find purpose. Some become it." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as Mariposa batted at Ranger's snout. Lucy glanced sideways. "You don't have to stay long. I know you're busy." Emma didn't answer immediately. She reached into her bag, pulled out a pair of worn rubber gloves. "Actually, I emailed my advisor, told them I needed the summer off, mental health break." Lucy blinked. "Are you serious?" Emma turned to her, expression unreadable for a beat, then softened. "I think I'd like to help. If you'll let me." Lucy felt something loosen inside her, like a thread pulled free after months of tight winding. She nodded. "I'd like that." Later that afternoon, Ben returned from town with fresh feed and wood panels for a new pen. He had decided to stay on a little while longer, as he kept saying, though the supplies he bought hinted at permanence. He wore a canvas jacket now, sun-touched and dusty, and had started humming while he worked. Lucy had teased him about it. "You hum when you're content," she told him once. "No, I hum when I'm in denial," he'd replied, grinning. Together they worked on building a new enclosure behind the barn, one meant for the transitional phase between rescue and release. Lucy's vision was becoming clearer by the day. Cedar Ridge wouldn't just be her refuge, but a rehabilitation sanctuary for injured or orphaned wildlife. Not a zoo, not captivity, but a haven between harm and healing. They were installing the final post when Roy arrived, this time bringing his niece's son, Tyler, a lanky 12-year-old with oversized glasses and a quiet disposition. Tyler had recently lost his family's old Labrador and hadn't smiled in weeks. But when Mariposa wobbled up to the fence and plopped over with a chirp, Tyler's face cracked into wonder. "She likes you," Roy said, nudging the boy gently. Tyler sat cross-legged in the dirt, inching closer. "I've never seen a bobcat kitten before." "That one's special," Lucy told him. "Born in a storm, survived the cold, and she thinks she's half dog now." Ranger came to lie beside the boy, his head settling near Tyler's knee. For the first time since arriving, Tyler smiled. Roy leaned toward Lucy. "Your grandfather would have been proud, not just of this, Isaboo," he gestured around, "but of how you've opened the gates instead of closing them." That evening, as the sun dipped low over the ridge, Emma helped clean the feeding bowls while Lucy wrote the day's notes. Ranger stood by the barn door, watching the treetops. The kittens were tumbling in the straw under Willow's lazy gaze. Mariposa stopped, stretched, and made a single bound toward the wire mesh, her little paw landing perfectly on Ranger's nose. Lucy laughed. "She's gonna be trouble." Ben, leaning against the post, smiled. "Or a miracle." From then on, people in the town began calling Ranger the guardian of the ridge. It started with Roy, then spread to the local feed store and the nearby rescue center. To Lucy, though, it wasn't a nickname. It was a title he'd earned with silence, strength, and unwavering loyalty. Cedar Ridge was no longer just a place. It was a home of second chances. And everyone there, two-legged, four-legged, wild or tamed, was living proof. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or lightning. Sometimes they come in silence. A wounded bobcat curled in straw. A dog who chooses to protect instead of chase. A daughter who returns home not out of obligation, but out of love reborn. This story reminds us that God doesn't always speak in grand gestures. He whispers through instinct, through loyalty, through second chances and quiet healing. He sends his angels in many forms, some with wings, some with paws, and some with notebooks and muddy boots. In our everyday lives, we often rush past the small wonders, but it's in those very moments, when we stop, breathe, and choose compassion, that we find the fingerprints of grace. Cedar Ridge became more than a farm. It became a sanctuary of faith and action. So, if you believe that no creature is too wild to be saved, that no heart is too broken to be healed, and that God is still writing miracles in the most unexpected places, share this story. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next journey of hope. And if you believe in the power of redemption, for animals, for people, for us all, type Amen in the comments. May God bless every soul who found comfort in this story, and may we all be guardians in our own corners of the world.